Jack Thompson had always been a simple man, a man of quiet strength, the kind who found satisfaction in the small, tangible victories of life: a freshly mowed lawn, a neatly painted fence, the gentle creak of a well-oiled porch swaying in the evening breeze. His little corner of the world was his sanctuary, a place where he could unwind after long days at the local hardware store, where he worked as a skilled craftsman, known for his steady hands and meticulous attention to detail. So, when Jack decided to build a small, functional shed in his backyard, it was a project he approached with the same care and precision that had defined his life for decades. He spent weeks carefully measuring the plot, sketching out blueprints, and double-checking the HOA guidelines to ensure that his shed would comply with every regulation: the height, the distance from the property line, the paint color, all meticulously planned and executed. The shed itself was a modest, wooden structure with a sloped roof and sturdy double doors, the kind of simple, practical design that Jack favored. It was meant to house his tools, his lawnmower, and the various odds and ends that had accumulated over the years. Nothing more, nothing less. But not everyone shared Jack's appreciation for simplicity. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, was a woman with a sharp eye for detail and an even sharper tongue. She prided herself on maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood, a term she used frequently and with great self-importance. To Karen, the slightest deviation from her rigid, unspoken rules was an affront to the carefully curated image of suburban perfection she had worked so hard to maintain. It was on a bright, breezy Saturday morning that Karen first laid eyes on Jack's shed. She had been walking her perfectly groomed poodle, Bella, down the narrow, winding path that ran along the back of Jack's property when she caught a glimpse of the freshly painted wooden structure through a gap in the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that lined his yard. She paused, her sharp, blue eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the shed's simple, unadorned frame, its clean, straight lines standing in stark contrast to the ornate, carefully manicured gardens that surrounded it. Karen's lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line, her fingers tightening around Bella's leash as she took a few, hesitant steps closer, her polished, designer heels sinking slightly into the soft, freshly mowed grass as she craned her neck for a better view. The shed, with its plain, functional design and unadorned wooden siding, struck her as an unwelcome intrusion, a blemish on the otherwise pristine landscape of her carefully curated domain. By the time she reached the edge of Jack's yard, her irritation had blossomed into full-blown outrage, her carefully maintained facade of polite, suburban civility cracking under the weight of her mounting indignation. She stormed up the narrow, gravel path that led to Jack's back porch, her sharp, staccato footsteps echoing off the weathered wooden boards as she reached the door and raised a perfectly manicured fist to knock. Jack, who had been inside his shed, carefully arranging his tools on a freshly installed set of wall-mounted hooks, heard the sharp, insistent rapping of Karen's knuckles against his door and sighed, setting down his hammer with a quiet, resigned clink before wiping his hands on a well-worn rag and making his way to the back steps. He opened the door to find Karen standing there, her pale, angular face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl, her bright, perfectly styled blonde hair glowing like a halo in the harsh morning sunlight. "Good morning, Karen," Jack said, his deep, steady voice carrying a faint hint of weariness as he stepped out onto the porch, his large, calloused hands hanging loosely at his sides. "What can I do for you?" Karen's eyes narrowed, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a fierce, judgmental scowl as she crossed her arms over her chest, her fingers tapping impatiently against the soft, pastel fabric of her designer blouse. "That," she snapped, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger toward the shed, her voice sharp, brittle, "is a violation of HOA guidelines." Jack felt his jaw tighten, his broad, square shoulders tensing slightly as he followed her gaze to the shed, its freshly painted walls glowing softly in the bright, mid-morning sunlight. "I don't believe it is," he replied, his tone calm, measured, his deep, dark eyes never leaving hers. "I checked the guidelines carefully before I built it. The height, the setbacks, the paint color, everything is within the rules." Karen's lips thinned, her pale cheeks flushing a faint shade of pink as she straightened, her chin tilting up in a defiant, almost regal gesture. "Well," she snapped, her voice rising an octave as her frustration began to seep through the cracks in her polished, suburban facade. "It's an eyesore, and it doesn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood. It needs to come down." Jack took a slow, steadying breath, his large, calloused hands clenching into fists at his sides as he met her icy, blue glare with one of his own. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen, Karen," he said, his voice low, steady, his tone carefully controlled. "The shed stays." And with that, he turned on his heel, his broad, muscular frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the sunlit lawn as he stepped back into his house, the heavy, wooden door creaking shut behind him with a sharp, final click, leaving Karen standing alone on the porch, her fists clenched, her chest heaving with barely contained fury. Jack awoke to the harsh, metallic clank of something scraping against metal. For a brief, disoriented moment, he thought he might still be dreaming, the sound blending strangely with the distant chirping of the morning birds and the low, rhythmic hum of his refrigerator. But as the noise grew louder, sharper, more insistent, he sat up quickly, the thin, worn sheets of his bed slipping from his broad shoulders as he swung his legs over the side and reached for his boots. He pulled them on quickly, his large, calloused hands moving with the practiced, automatic precision of a man who had spent decades rising before dawn, his mind still groggy with sleep as he stumbled toward the kitchen window. He reached for the thin, worn cord of the blinds, his fingers tightening around the frayed, sun-bleached fabric as he pulled them open, his dark eyes narrowing as he took in the chaotic scene unfolding in his backyard. A group of men, dressed in bright, reflective orange vests and hard hats, were swarming around his shed, their heavy, steel-toed boots crunching against the freshly mowed grass as they measured, poked, and prodded at the wooden structure with long, metal rods and digital calipers. One of them, a short, stocky man with a thick, salt and pepper beard, was crouched at the base of the shed, his gloved hands digging into the loose, compacted soil as he muttered to himself, his head bobbing in time with the rapid, staccato clicks of his clipboard pen. Standing a few feet behind them, her sharp, angular features twisted into a thin, satisfied smile, was Karen. She had her arms crossed over her chest, her polished, pastel blouse glowing softly in the bright morning sunlight as she watched the men work, her sharp, blue eyes darting back and forth as if she were conducting a carefully choreographed dance. Jack felt his fists clench at his sides, his pulse quickening as he watched one of the men lean in close to the shed's freshly painted exterior, his thick, gloved fingers pressing against the smooth, polished wood as he peered at the thin, dark lines of the grain, his head tilting slightly, as if searching for some hidden flaw. Another worker, a tall, thin man with a thin, angular face and a neatly trimmed mustache, stepped back a few paces, his narrow, beady eyes flicking nervously toward Karen as he pulled a small, silver camera from his pocket and began snapping rapid, high-resolution photos of the shed's corner joints and roofline. Jack felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his broad, square shoulders coiling like a spring as he watched the men work, his mind racing with 1,000 silent, angry thoughts. He had followed the guidelines, measured every inch, checked and rechecked the setback distances, the height, the paint color, everything. And now, here they were, his so-called neighbors, digging around in his yard like a pack of feral dogs, searching for any excuse, any minor flaw, any tiny, insignificant crack or blemish they could exploit. He took a deep, steadying breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort as he forced himself to remain calm, his dark eyes never leaving Karen's thin, pale face as she paced slowly back and forth behind the workers, her sharp, polished heels clicking softly against the gravel path that ran along the edge of his yard. She paused briefly, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, almost imperceptible frown as one of the men straightened, his thick, gloved hands brushing the loose dirt from his knees as he leaned in close to whisper something in her ear. Karen's lips curled into a thin, satisfied smile, her pale, angular face glowing with a faint, vindictive flush as she nodded sharply, her head bobbing in quick, sharp jerks as the man turned and resumed his work, his hands moving quickly, efficiently, as if spurred on by the silent, unspoken promise of some unseen reward. Jack felt a slow, simmering rage build in his chest, his large, calloused hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists as he watched the men dig, measure, and snap their photos, their sharp, metallic tools glinting in the bright morning sunlight like the polished teeth of a predator. He knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary inspection, no routine check for structural integrity or safety compliance. This was an attack, a coordinated, deliberate assault on his home, his sanctuary, his carefully constructed refuge from the chaos and noise of the outside world. And it was being led, orchestrated, and executed by Karen herself. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows across his freshly mowed lawn, Jack stepped out onto his back porch, his broad, muscular frame silhouetted against the warm, golden glow of the setting sun as he made his way slowly, deliberately toward the shed. He had spent the entire day fuming, his mind racing with 1,000 silent, angry thoughts as he replayed the morning's events over and over in his mind, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides as he imagined the cold, sharp click of Karen's polished, pastel heels against the weathered wooden boards of his porch. But as he reached the shed, his boots crunching softly against the loose, compacted gravel of the narrow path that led to its door, he felt his breath catch in his throat, his dark eyes narrowing in shock as he took in the scene before him. The shed's carefully painted exterior, once smooth, polished, and unblemished, was now covered in deep, jagged scratches and dents, the thin, rough edges of the gouges catching the faint, dying light of the setting sun like the twisted, broken teeth of a long-dead predator. Jack felt a slow, simmering rage build in his chest, his fists clenching into tight, white-knuckled balls at his sides as he reached out, his large, calloused fingers tracing the rough, uneven edges of the gouges, his mind racing with 1,000 silent, furious thoughts as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that someone had taken a crowbar to his shed, their heavy, steel-tipped tools slicing through the polished wooden siding like a hot knife through butter. And he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, exactly who that someone was. Jack awoke the next morning to the faint, distant hum of a car engine idling at the curb outside his house. He frowned, his dark, calloused hands tightening around the edge of his thin, worn bedsheet as he listened to the low, steady rumble, his mind still foggy with the remnants of a restless night's sleep. He had barely managed to close his eyes after discovering the deep, jagged scratches on the door of his shed, his mind racing with 1,000 silent, angry thoughts as he tried to piece together the chain of events that had led to this latest act of petty, vindictive vandalism. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet sinking into the cool, worn carpet as he rose slowly, his broad, muscular frame silhouetted against the faint, gray light of the early morning sky as he crossed the small, cluttered space of his bedroom and reached for the thin, worn cord of the window blinds. He pulled them open slowly, his dark, sharp eyes narrowing as he peered through the thin, dusty slats, his heart sinking as he caught sight of the sleek, black SUV parked at the curb, its dark, tinted windows reflecting the soft, gray light of the overcast morning sky. He watched in silence as a short, stocky man in a crisp, dark suit climbed out of the driver's side door, his polished, black leather shoes clicking sharply against the rough, cracked asphalt as he made his way slowly, deliberately up the narrow, gravel path that led to Jack's front porch. The man paused briefly at the bottom of the steps, his thin, angular face twisted into a tight, disapproving scowl as he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, crisp, white envelope, its sharp, clean edges glowing softly in the faint, gray morning light. Jack felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his broad, square shoulders coiling like a spring as he watched the man climb the steps to his porch, his polished, leather shoes clacking sharply against the weathered wooden boards as he reached the door and slipped the envelope through the narrow gap between the frame and the thick, rusted metal of the old, brass doorknob. The man hesitated for a brief, telling moment, his sharp, beady eyes flicking nervously toward the dark, shadowed windows of Jack's house, as if expecting to see a face staring back at him, before turning on his heel and making his way back down the steps, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed against the cool, damp morning air as he climbed back into the SUV and sped off down the street, the low, throaty rumble of the engine echoing off the cracked, uneven pavement as the sleek, black vehicle disappeared around the corner. Jack took a deep, steadying breath, his large, calloused hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides as he turned away from the window and made his way slowly, deliberately toward the front door, his heavy, steel-tipped boots clomping softly against the worn, creaking floorboards as he reached for the thick, brass doorknob and pulled the door open with a sharp, irritated flick of his wrist. He reached down slowly, his broad, muscular frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the sunlit porch as he bent to pick up the thick, crisp envelope, its sharp, clean edges digging into his fingertips as he straightened, his dark, sharp eyes narrowing as he turned the envelope over in his hands, his heart sinking as he caught sight of the neat, blocky letters of the HOA's official seal stamped across the front in bright, bold blue ink. He tore the envelope open with a sharp, irritated flick of his wrist, his large, calloused fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the thick, heavy sheet of crisp, white paper contained within, his dark, sharp eyes scanning the densely typed text with a growing sense of dread as he took in the cold, impersonal language of the formal notice. Notice of violation, immediate demolition required. The letter claimed that Jack's shed was in violation of not just the HOA's aesthetic guidelines, but also multiple safety codes, including improper foundation placement, inadequate structural support, and unapproved materials, despite the fact that the structure had been professionally inspected and certified just weeks earlier. It demanded immediate demolition, with a hefty fine for each day the shed remained standing, and included a thinly veiled threat of legal action should Jack fail to comply. Jack felt his fists clench at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he read and reread the letter, his mind racing with 1,000 silent, furious thoughts as he tried to process the sheer, overwhelming absurdity of the situation. He had followed the guidelines, measured every inch, double-checked every regulation, and now, here he was, facing the very real possibility of financial ruin, all because of one woman's petty, vindictive grudge. But Karen wasn't finished. Over the next few days, Jack began to notice a subtle but unmistakable shift in the way his neighbors treated him. The small, friendly waves and nods he had grown accustomed to over the years were replaced by tight-lipped glares and averted eyes. The quiet, neighborly conversations he once enjoyed now reduced to strained, uncomfortable silences as his once friendly neighbors hurried past his house, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes darting nervously toward the narrow, gravel path that led to his shed. He heard whispers, faint, murmured accusations carried on the cool, evening breeze as he worked in his garden, the sharp, cutting words of gossip and speculation drifting through the thin, rustling leaves of his carefully cultivated hedges like the whispered hiss of a snake. Troublemaker. Doesn't respect the community. Dragging down our property values. Jack felt a slow, simmering rage build in his chest, his fists clenching into tight, white-knuckled balls at his sides as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had taken her campaign of petty, vindictive harassment to a whole new level, one that threatened not just his shed, but his entire way of life. As Karen sat at her kitchen table, a neatly organized stack of HOA documents spread out before her, she felt a slow, simmering satisfaction settle in her chest. She had spent weeks building her case against Jack, carefully compiling every scrap of evidence, every whispered rumor, every minor, insignificant violation she could find, her thin, carefully manicured fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished, glass surface of the table as she reviewed her notes, her sharp, blue eyes flicking back and forth across the densely typed pages like a hawk surveying its prey. She had convinced herself that she had Jack on the ropes, that his small, stubborn act of defiance would soon crumble beneath the weight of her relentless, unyielding pressure. She had the support of the HOA board, the whispered loyalty of her carefully cultivated network of allies, the silent, unspoken approval of her neighbors, who had come to see Jack as a troublemaker, a nuisance, a threat to their carefully maintained, perfectly manicured world of white picket fences and freshly mowed lawns. And now, at last, the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. She had arranged for a special, closed-door HOA meeting, scheduled for the following Thursday, where she would present her findings, lay out her case, and push for a final, decisive vote to have Jack Shed forcibly removed, his property fined, and his reputation permanently tarnished. She could already imagine the look of defeat on his rugged, weathered face as he watched his carefully constructed sanctuary crumble beneath the relentless, crushing weight of her authority. But as she reached for her coffee cup, the thin, white porcelain warm and smooth against her palm, she heard the sharp, insistent ring of her doorbell echo through the cool, quiet air of her kitchen, the shrill, metallic chime cutting through her thoughts like the sudden, jarring crack of a gunshot. She frowned, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, annoyed scowl as she set her cup down with a soft, irritated clink and rose slowly from her chair, her sharp, polished heels clicking softly against the cool, polished marble tiles as she made her way to the front door. She reached for the thick, brass doorknob, her long, perfectly manicured fingers tightening around the smooth, polished metal as she pulled the door open with a sharp, irritated flick of her wrist, her sharp, blue eyes narrowing in surprise as she found herself face to face with a tall, thin, sharply dressed man in a crisp, dark suit, his thin, angular face twisted into a tight, professional smile as he held out a thick, crisp, white envelope, its sharp, clean edges glowing softly in the bright, mid-morning sunlight. "Karen Miller?" the man asked, his voice smooth, polished, his tone dripping with the cold, impersonal confidence of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. Karen felt her jaw tighten, her thin, pale lips pressing into a tight, white line as she reached for the envelope, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling slightly as she took the thick, heavy packet from the man's outstretched hand, her sharp, blue eyes flicking nervously between his thin, unreadable face and the neat, blocky letters of the high-profile law firm's logo stamped across the front of the envelope. "Yes," she replied, her voice sharp, brittle, her tone laced with a faint, involuntary quaver as she took a small, hesitant step back, her thin, polished heels clicking sharply against the cool, polished tiles of her marble foyer as the man gave a short, curt nod, turned on his heel, and strode back down the narrow, gravel path that led to her front porch, his polished, black leather shoes clicking sharply against the rough, uneven pavement as he climbed into a sleek, black sedan and sped off. Down the street, the low, throaty rumble of the engine echoing off the neatly trimmed hedges that lined her carefully manicured front lawn. Karen closed the door slowly, her thin, trembling fingers tightening around the thick, crisp envelope as she made her way back to the kitchen, her sharp, polished heels clicking sharply against the cool, polished marble tiles as she sank back into her chair and tore the envelope open with a sharp, irritated flick of her wrist, her thin, pale lips twisting into a tight, white line as she unfolded the thick, heavy sheet of crisp, white paper contained within. Her sharp, blue eyes scanned the densely typed text, her thin, perfectly manicured fingers trembling slightly as she read and reread the letter, her heart sinking with a cold, sinking certainty as the full, horrifying implications of the message began to sink in. Jack Thompson, the quiet, unassuming neighbor she had spent weeks harassing, intimidating, and slandering, was not just a simple, hard-working man with a stubborn streak and a fondness for woodworking. He was a successful real estate investor and former contractor, with deep ties to local government officials and a personal net worth that dwarfed the combined property values of the entire neighborhood. Karen felt her heart skip a beat, her thin, pale lips parting in a silent, gasping breath as the thin, neatly typed lines of the letter seemed to blur before her eyes, her mind reeling with 1,000 silent, frantic thoughts as she realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that she had just declared war on a man with the power, influence, and resources to destroy her life, her reputation, and her carefully cultivated empire of petty, suburban authority. And Jack, it seemed, had finally decided to fight back. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, the cool, early evening air filled with the faint, distant hum of crickets and the low, rhythmic whisper of the wind through the tall, carefully manicured hedges that lined the narrow, winding streets of the neighborhood. Jack Thompson arrived early, his tall, broad frame silhouetted against the warm, golden glow of the setting sun as he made his way slowly, deliberately up the narrow, gravel path that led to the small, brightly lit community center where the meeting was to be held. He had dressed for the occasion, his normally rugged, work-worn hands encased in a pair of thin, black leather gloves, his broad, muscular frame wrapped in a crisp, dark suit, the sharp, clean lines of the tailored fabric hugging his powerful, well-defined shoulders as he strode through the double doors and into the cool, brightly lit foyer of the building, his polished, black leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished, white marble tiles. The room was already filling with his neighbors, their quiet, whispered conversations echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling as they gathered in tight, nervous clusters, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the soft, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, furtive glances, their eyes darting nervously toward the empty, high-backed chair at the front of the room, its polished wooden surface gleaming softly in the harsh, artificial glow. Jack made his way slowly, deliberately toward the front of the room, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the assembled crowd as he reached the polished, wooden podium and set down the thick, leather-bound stack of documents he had brought with him, his large, calloused hands moving with the calm, measured precision of a man accustomed to control, to power, to authority. Karen arrived a few minutes later, her sharp, angular features twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she strode quickly, purposefully up the narrow, gravel path that led to the front entrance of the building, her sharp, polished heels clicking sharply against the rough, uneven pavement as she pushed open the heavy, glass doors and swept into the room, her pale, carefully made-up face glowing faintly in the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as she made her way to the front of the room, her sharp, blue eyes flicking nervously toward the thick, leather-bound stack of documents that lay on the polished, wooden surface of the podium. For a long, tense moment, neither of them spoke, the cool, still air of the room filled only with the faint, nervous murmurs of the assembled crowd, their pale, drawn faces turned expectantly toward the front of the room as they watched the two figures, their postures stiff, tense, their faces twisted into tight, unreadable masks of determination and barely contained anger. Finally, Jack reached for the thick, leather-bound stack of documents, his large, calloused fingers tightening around the smooth, polished cover as he flipped it open and cleared his throat, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air like a blade as he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice low, steady, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as his sharp, dark eyes scanned the assembled crowd, his broad, muscular frame radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence. "I have come here tonight to address the numerous, baseless accusations that have been leveled against me by your HOA president, Karen Miller." A faint, nervous murmur rippled through the crowd, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes darting nervously between Jack's tall, imposing frame and the sharp, angular features of their once loyal leader, her pale, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her sharp, polished heels clicking softly against the polished, white marble tiles as she crossed and uncrossed her long, slender legs. Jack took a deep, steadying breath, his broad, muscular shoulders rising and falling with the effort as he reached for the top sheet of paper in the thick, leather-bound stack of documents, his large, calloused fingers trembling slightly as he pulled the crisp, white sheet free and held it up for the assembled crowd to see, his sharp, dark eyes never leaving Karen's pale, trembling face as he began to read. "First," he said, his deep, dark voice ringing out through the still, silent air of the room, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he continued. "I have here a certified copy of my property survey, clearly indicating that my shed is well within the legal boundaries of my property, in full compliance with all local building codes and HOA guidelines." A faint, nervous murmur rippled through the crowd, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes darting nervously between Jack's tall, imposing frame and the sharp, angular features of their once loyal leader. Her pale, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her sharp, polished heels clicking softly against the polished, white marble tiles as she crossed and uncrossed her long, slender legs. Jack continued, his deep, dark voice ringing out through the still, silent air of the room, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he laid out his case, his large, calloused fingers flipping through the thick, leather-bound stack of documents with the practiced, automatic precision of a man accustomed to control, to power, to authority. By the time he had finished, the room had fallen into a tense, strained silence, the faint, nervous whispers of the assembled crowd replaced by a quiet, stunned stillness as they stared, wide-eyed, at the thick, leather-bound stack of documents that lay on the polished, wooden surface of the podium, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes flicking nervously toward the sharp, angular features of their once loyal leader, her pale, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she rose slowly, unsteadily from her seat, and stumbled toward the door, her sharp, polished heels clicking sharply against the polished, white marble tiles as she fled the room. Weeks later, Karen received a thick, crisp, white envelope in the mail, a court summons, informing her that Jack had filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against her for harassment, property damage, and emotional distress, his extensive network of contacts and resources ensuring that the case would move quickly, efficiently, and with devastating effect. The HOA, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, voted unanimously to remove her as president, her carefully cultivated empire of petty, suburban authority crumbling beneath the relentless, crushing weight of the truth.